Hello everyone, welcome back to the Politdigm channel. My name is Red and today we're back with another episode of Politdigm Reads, where today we are back with the fourth episode of reading Yanis Varoufakis' Technofeudalism, What Killed Capitalism. In the last episode, we read chapter 3, and today we are going to start with chapter 4, called The Rise of the Cloudless and Demise of Profit. However, before the episode starts, I just want to remind you that if you enjoy our content and want to support us, you can do so over on Patreon, or if you can support us in a monetary way, you can check out our website to learn how you can support us in alternative matters. If you want to do so, there is a link in the description below. Also, make sure to join our Discord server. Anybody can join. However, if you do join and support us over on Patreon, you get access to some special perks, like being able to submit questions to our weekly Q&A that we host on the Politdigm podcast. And also make sure to support us over at our social media platforms so that you can keep up with date with the newest news about Politdigm and whatever we are working on. One more thing that I would like to add is that I am currently ill. You probably noticed that the part where I was doing the, talking about the Patreon and stuff like that, which I've turned into a bit of a pre-recorded thing, otherwise I have to constantly repeat myself. But if you notice that my voice is strange, is because I'm ill. And so I sound nasally, I have a common cold, nothing that is going to kill me. But I think I should bring it up since it does affect my voice and is making my nose all screwed up. So I wanted to mention that. So I'm sorry that I sound weird, that it may, put you off listening to this episode. But keep that in mind, that if I sound weird or if my voice does a weird tremble or if I say a word wrong is, either because, as you would know by now, I'm pretty dyslexic, sorry. To prove myself that I am dyslexic, I have trouble saying the word dyslexic. And, now I'm nasally and having a cold, so that doesn't help. Anyways, as I said, this is episode 4. And of course, chapter 4. And in the last episode, Yanis finally basically defined what exactly cloud capital is and kind of sets up the idea of technofeudalism and how it works and how it, in his eyes, has come to replace capitalism as we once knew it. Of course, whilst, defining cloud capital, he talks about kind of the different positions that each of us hold in technofeudalism. And of course, if you want to learn more about that, check out the last episode. That is the best way for you to learn about exactly what each term means. So let's start reading. The last time you left the family home in Politdigm was in the summer of 2020, when you came to visit us on the island of Aegina, as you asked to do every summer. That journey to Aegina was a joyous break from the suffocating lockdown of the pandemic's first phase. But it must have taken its toll, because the following morning you didn't emerge from your room until well after 11. You found me on the veranda, peering into news sites on my laptop. I was beside myself. As you sat down next to me, I exclaimed, "The age of cloud capital has just begun in London." Half an hour or so earlier, the people of Britain had woken up to the news that the pandemic had caused the worst recession in history. Apparently, the UK's national income had fallen by a whopping 20.4%, far worse than any comparable figures in America or continental Europe. Wrench news it certainly was, though not of the sort that undermines one's worldview. It was what followed 15 minutes later, just before you woke up, that changed the way I saw the world. Instead of plummeting in response to the data, the London Stock Exchange jumped up by 2.3%. We are witnessing something utterly at odds with any variety of capitalism. I remember telling you with as much authority as I could muster. Nah, capitalism is full of paradoxes, you reply. But Dad, this is not one of capitalism's many paradoxes. It is unequivocal proof that the world of money has, finally, decoupled from the capitalist world. Unimpressed, you choose to stare out over the Saronic Sea towards the mountains of the Peloponnese, leaving me to reckon with what had truly gone down in London on that Wednesday morning in August 2020. Share markets do rise in response to bad news, but only when the news, however awful, turns out at least somewhat better than anticipated. Had stockbrokers predicted, say, a 22% fall in the UK's national income, markets would have had a good cause to rise if the actual fall on the day was only, in quotes, 20.4%. Except on that Wednesday, the markets were expecting a drop of no more than 15%. That's what made the 12th of August 2020 so bizarre. News far worse than anticipated had caused the share market to rise. Nothing like it had happened before. So what had happened? The news, it turns out, was so bad that traders in the City of London had the following realization. When things are this dismal, the Bank of England panics. And what have panicky central banks been doing since the crash of 2008? They print money and give it to us. And what do we do with all the freshly minted dough from the central bank? We buy shares, sending their prices up. And if prices are destined to go up, only a fool would miss out on the action. A wall of printed money is surely on its way to us. Time to buy. And buy they did, causing the City of London to defy the gravitational laws of capitalism. The trend was not confined to London. As the pandemic began to rip through our communities, authorities on both sides of the Atlantic, in Japan and elsewhere, responded by doing a lot more of what they had been doing since the American's Minotaur death in 2008, printing money to give to the financiers in the hope that it would butters investment in business, thus generating stable jobs and preventing the economy from collapsing. It didn't. Fearing that run-of-the-mill businesses would not be able to repay them, the financiers lent the central bank money only to big business. The big businesses either refused to invest or invested solely in cloud capital. Conglomerates found on traditional terrestrial capital like General Electric and Volkswagen refused to invest the interest-free central bank money because when they surveyed the ongoing carnage of the pandemic, they saw the same thing their bankers had seen. Masses of little people condemned to low wages, bullshit jobs, and diminished prospects. A sea of people unable to afford new high-value products. So why invest in such stuff? Instead, they would do something riskless, profitable, and stress-free. They used it to buy back their own company shares, boosting their company's share price, and along with it, their own bonuses. Meanwhile, Big Tech was having an even more fabulous pandemic. While the US economy shed 30 million jobs in a single month, Amazon bucked the trend, appearing to a swathe of Americans as a hybrid of the Red Cross, delivering essential parcels to confined citizens, and Roosevelt's New Deal, hiring 100,000 extra staff and paying them a couple of extra dollars an hour to boot. True Big Tech did invest the central bank cash, and it did create new jobs. But the jobs it created were those of cloud pros, and the investment was in building up its cloud capital. Even cloudless companies that had a bad pandemic, like Uber and Airbnb, whose customers were unable to use their services, took the central bank money, and invested in more cloud capital, as if there was no pandemic. It was the pandemic with the flood of state money, it unleashed that ushered in the age of cloud capital. And if we want a milestone with which to mark its formal arrival, that summer's morning will do nicely. But as I have hinted already, the story of the rise of cloud capital on the back of state money actually begins earlier than this. For it was in the wake of the crash of 2008 that the state money began to be printed en masse by the world's central banks and started to have its strange and counterintuitive effect on profit. Your fireside stories of metal workers and ironsmiths in particular, accelerating history, fascinated me no end, as you know. In the decades since, however, I have become more and more skeptical of the narratives that place too much emphasis on technology and not enough on how powerful groups seize and manipulate it to achieve and maintain dominion over others. The steam engine would have been a historical footnote were it not for the capitalist who weaponized it so as to dispose the then ruling class, the feudalists. However, it is not a given that every significant new technological breakthrough will spawn a distinctly new form of capital to be seized upon by the new revolutionary class. The technological breakthrough of the second industrial revolution, the electricity grid, the telegraph, later the telephone, highways packed with automobiles, television networks, these expensive networks of phenomenal machinery may have spawned a big business, big finance, and the Great Depression, the war economy, Bretton Woods, the post-war technostructure, the European Union, and built the modern world that your generation and mine took for granted. But they give rise to neither a new type of capital nor a new class who could change the capitalist for dominance. But the technologies that spawned cloud capital have proved more revolutionary than any of their predecessors. Through them, cloud capital has developed capacities that previous types of capital goods never had. It has become at once an attention holder, a desired manufacturer, a drive for proletarian labor of cloud proles, an elicitor of massive free labor from cloud serfs, and to boot, the creator of totally privatized digital transaction spaces, cloud thieves like Amazon.com, in which neither buyers nor sellers enjoy any of the options they would in normal markets. As a result, its owners, the cloudalists, have acquired the ability to do that which the Edisons, the Westinghouses, and the Fords never could, to turn themselves into a revolutionary class, actively displacing the capitalists from the top of society's pecking order. In the process, the cloudalists, some consciously, others unthinkingly, have changed everything that previous varieties of capitalism had taught us to take for granted. The idea of what constitutes a commodity, the ideals of the autonomous individual, the ownership of identity, the propagation of culture, the context of politics, the nature of the state, the texture of geopolitics. The pressing question is, how did the cloudalists finance all this? The early industrialists founded their factories, steamships, and canals with the blood and sweat of African slave labor and loot from American and South Asian lands and peoples. Later, the Edisons, the Westinghouses, and the Fords used the monies conjured from thin air by private bankers who morphed into big finance in the process. The cloudalists did something subtler and more impressive. They helped themselves to the rivers of cash that were being printed by the central banks of developed capitalist states. It was nothing short of a coup. Imagine getting the world's richest capitalist states to print the money that allows you to build a new type of capital stock. Imagine that this new type of capital stock comes with the inbuilt superpower to get billions of people to reproduce it on your behalf for free. Imagine further that this type of capital, funded by the state monies and reproduced by citizens, free labor, intensifies your power to extract surplus value from the proletarians who are working for shrinking wages under worsening conditions, but also from from capitalists forced to remove their wares from traditional markets and to sell them by your cloud capital. You wouldn't even need to laugh all the way to the bank, since you would be much wiser to keep your stupendous gains stowed in some digital wallet within your cloud capital empire, rather than in an account with some pathetic banker. It sounds implausible. How on earth did the cloudalists convince major central banks to fund them in this way? The answer is, they didn't have to. In the 15 years since capitalism's near-death experience, central bankers have been printing monies and channeling them to the financiers entirely of their own accord. In their minds, they have been saving capitalism. In reality, they have been upending it by helping to finance the emergence of cloud capital. But that's how history arrives, on the coattails of unintended consequences. The central bank money printing bonanza began in 2008, shortly after the comprehensive implosion of the West's banking sector. Politicians and central bankers then feared that if they let the banks fail and people's savings disappear, as Herbert Hoover's administration had done in 1929, they would precipitate a second Great Depression. So at their London summit in April 2009, the G7 central bankers, along with their presidents and prime ministers, agreed to do whatever it took to refloat the banks. That was sensible. What was preposterous was that in addition to saving the failed banks, they bailed out the quasi-criminal bankers responsible for their failure, along with their lethal practices. And far worse, in addition to practicing socialism for the bankers, they subjected workers and the middle class to vicious austerity. Cutting public expenditure in the midst of a great recession is always a terrible idea. Doing so while also printing mountains of money for the financiers wins the prize of conspicuous stupidity. Not only was it a brazen double standard that did untold damage to a generation's faith in the political class, it did something lethal to the economy. Austerity is not just bad for workers and people in need of a state support during tough times. It also murders investment. In any economy, what we spend collectively translates automatically into what we earn collectively. The definition of a recession is when private expenditure is failing. By reducing public expenditure at precisely the same moment, the state accelerates the decline of the economy-wide expenditure and thus hastens the rate at which an economy total's income is falling. And if society's total income is falling, businesses are hardly going to spend money building up capacity when consumers don't have the money to buy. That's how austerity slays investment. With investment first knocked out by the crash of 2008 and finished off soon after by austerity, throwing new money at the financiers was never going to resurrect it. Put yourself in the position of a capitalist at a time when austerity is eliminating your consumer's income. Suppose I give you $1 billion to pay with for free, i.e., at a zero interest rate. Naturally, you will take the free billions, but as we've established, you would be mad to invest it in the new production lines. So what are you going to do with the free cash? You could buy real estate or art, or better still, shares in your own company. That way, the shares in your company appreciate in value, and if you are the CEO running it, your stature Add share-linked bonuses rises too. No new investment, in other words, but a lot more power in the hands of the powerful. This is exactly what happened. Seeing that the vast majority were likely to be stuck in poverty and precarity for the foreseeable future, big business went on history's deepest and longest investment strike, while spending large sums on things like real estate deals that gentrified neighborhoods and deepened divides. Every Gilded Age has seen inequality rise, with the rich profiting faster than the poor. The post-2000 era was different. Inequality rose not because the poor saw their incomes rise more slowly than the rich. No, their income actually fell, just as the financiers and big business ranked it in. When an activist state makes fabulously wealthier the same bankers whose quasi-criminal activities brought misery to the majority, while they are punished with self-defeating austerity, two new climate times beacon: poisoned politics and permanent stagnation. The poisoned politics we need not to elaborate on. For Greece's neo-Nazis to America's Donald Trump, we have all lived through the nightmare. But permanent stagnation. Why would more wealth for the ultra-rich stagnate capitalism, and how did it lend to the funding of cloud capital? The term inflation refers to an increase across the board in price of most things. Sometimes when the price of bread rises, it simply is because flour has suddenly become scarce, or bread more fashionable. But in case of inflation, the price of one thing rises because the price of everything is going up, so everyone needs more dollars, yens, or euros in order to buy loaves of bread or a cup of coffee or a smartphone, not just the baker. That's how inflation depletes money's exchange value. Capitalism famously drove a wedge between the value and price of things. Money was no exception. Money's exchange value reflects people's readiness to hand over valuable things for a given sum of cash, a value that inflation diminishes, as we have just seen. But under capitalism, money also acquired a distinct market price, the rate of interest you must pay in order to lease a pile of cash for a given period. The price of potatoes drops when there are stockpile potatoes that no one wants to buy. In just the same way, when the demand of money, or loans that is, lingers below the quantity of money available to the lend, its price, the interest rate, declines. Under capitalism, big business has the capacity to borrow most of the money that lenders, mostly rich people with large savings, are willing to lend, which is what they are doing when they invest in a bond. So it is big business with its appetite for borrowing that determines the overall demand for money. In theory, central bankers are able to influence interest rates by adjusting the rate at which they lend money to other bankers, allowing them to pass on the lower rate, and thereby to stimulate or discourage investment. But overall, interest rates are determined, as with any market, by the overall supply of and demand for money. After 2008, and especially during the pandemic, a strange thing happened. Money held its exchange value. That whole period, from late 2008 to early 2022, was one of very low, sometimes negative, inflation. But at the same time, its price, i.e. the interest rate, tanked, even turning negative on many occasions. This was a reflection of the fact that austerity was nullifying business investment, and so people's demand for money was pitiful. But surely, if the central bankers kept reducing interest rates, there would eventually come a point where money was sufficiently cheap that borrowing and investing would pick up again. Not so. In the case of potatoes, microchips, or cars, falling prices generally cure an oversupply problem, i.e., where supply outweighs demand. In exactly this way, Bargain hunters swoop in while producers cut output, and thus the price correction eliminates the excess supply. But when it comes to money, something different happens. When it's priced, the interest rate drops fast, capitalists panic. Instead of rejoicing that they can now borrow more cheaply, they think, sure, it is a good thing that I can borrow for the next of nothing. But for the central bank to allow interest rates to drop so much, things must be looking grim. I won't invest even if they hand me the money. That's the reason investment refused to recover even after central bankers cut money's official price to almost zero. And that was only half of their post-2008 nightmare. The other half was the failed bankers' stranglehold over everyone, including central banks and governments, a legacy of 3 decades of the American Minotaur's rule over global capitalism. Their stranglehold came in handy once their banks began sequentially to topple between 2007 and 2011. One panicky phone call was usually all it took for a banker to get the state to bail him out and give him an open-ended overdraft facility. From late 2008 to early 2022, Europe's, America's, and Japan's central banks pushed walls of freshly minted cash into the accounts of the financiers, making the interest rate conjure far worse than it already was. By boosting magnificently the supply of monies that big business refused to invest, socialism for financiers pushed the interest rate deeper and deeper towards negative territory. It was a strange new world. Negative prices make sense in the case of bads, the opposite of goods. When a factory wants to get rid of toxic waste, it charges a negative price for it. Its managers pay someone to get rid of it. A costly process, especially if it is done in an ecologically considerate manner. But how could money become a bad to be offloaded? When central banks began to treat money like a car manufacturer treats spent sulfuric acid or a nuclear power plant station its radioactive wastewater, that's when we knew there was something rotten in the kingdom of financialized capitalism. How can money acquire a negative price? It was you, Dad, who helped me come to grips with the paradox of negative interest rates. By introducing me to Einstein's theory that light has 2 natures, you opened my mind to the twin nature of labor, capital, and yes, money. Money's first nature is that of a commodity that we trade like any other for other commodities. But money, like language, is also a reflection of our relationship to one another. It echoes how we transform matter and shape to the world around us. It quantifies our alienated ability to do things together as a collective. Once we recognize money's second nature, everything makes a lot more sense. For it was the collective ability that was broken. Poisoned money flowed in torrents, but not into serious investments, good quality jobs, or anything capable of reanimating capitalism's lost animal spirit. Instead, shareholders and executives bought land, empty warehouses, art, Swiss chalets, whole villages in Italy, and even islands in Greece, the Caribbean, and the Pacific. They collected football clubs, super yachts, and at some point began to buy digital assets like Bitcoin or something called NFTs that they neither understood nor knew what to do with. This is how socialism for bankers and austerity for the rest of us thwarted capitalism's dynamism, shoving it into a state of gilded stagnation. As we shall now see, cloud capital was the only pulsating stirring force to benefit from the poisoning of money. I remember being puzzled during the late 60s when you and Mom would sometimes diverge from your obsessive discussions about the junta, the term the Greeks used for the fascist dictatorship ruining our lives, to talk about something called the right. From what I could gather, it sounded like a cross between the divine and the abominable. So I asked you, what is the right exactly? After your usual journey through the mists of history, describing how in the National Assembly, spawned by the French Revolution in 1789, hardened revolutionaries wanting to topple the king and his regime sat on the left-hand side of the assembly, while the king's supporters took the seats on the right. Later, once capitalism had been established, the right came to be identified with the interests of capitalists and a fervent opposition to organized labor or state intervention. You eventually came to this gist of what it represented in our era. People on the right of politics believe that hard work aimed at private profit is the surest route to a wealth and good society. People on the left don't. Later, I appreciated your definition better when exposed to the writings of Adam Smith, the 18th century Scottish economist who is something like the patron saint of free marketeers. Yes, factory owners driving 14-year-old workers into an early grave were brutish, but Smith argued that the needs of society, more and cheaper clothes, shelter, food, the stuff of prosperity, could not be met with moralizers or do-gooders. Only the capitalist passion for profit could provide these. Why? Because to profit, it was not enough to squeeze the living daylight out of their workers. After all, their competitors did the same. No, to steal a march on the competition, capitalists had to invest in new machines, for example, that could cut their costs and allow them to undercut their competitors' prices. It was in this manner, driven by the profit motive, that society would equip itself to manufacture sufficient quantities of life's essentials and at the lowest price possible. According to Smith, it is because of capitalists' cutthroat profit hunger, not in spite of it, that capitalism begat wealth and progress. As he wrote in The Wealth of Nations in 1776, by pursuing his own interest, he frequently promotes that of the society more effectually than when he really intends to promote it. I have never known much good done by those who affected to trade for the public good. The crash of 1929 and the Great Depression took the shine off profit-driven markets. But throughout each of capitalism's subsequent metamorphoses, during the New Deal, the war economy, the era of Bretton Woods, and particularly with the rise of the technostructure and the Minotaur, the profit remained its driving force. Coupled with that, profit was the power that turned the cogs and wheels of every form of capitalism that the planet had seen. Until following the events of 2008, the global North's central banks fell into the trap of pumping unending quantities of poisoned monies into the financial markets. Then, for the first time since capitalism has stirred 2.5 centuries earlier, profit ceased to be the fuel that fired the global economy's engine, driving investment and innovation. The role of fueling the economy was taken over by central bank money. Profit remained the ambition of every capitalist, the goal of every vendor, the aspiration of people battling for a more comfortable life. But the accumulation of capital, the process that creates wealth by increasing the overall size of the pie, decoupled from profits just as the end of Bretton Woods and the subsequent rise of the Minotaur had decoupled hard work from rising living standards. It was not the intention of central bankers to replace profits. They simply fell into a trap they had created for themselves. The panic of 2008 had killed off the demand for money to be invested, causing an oversupply of money that depressed interest rates. The more interest rates fell, the greater the investors' conviction that things were so bad it would be madness to invest. And yet, trillions of dollars of central bank money continued to pour into finance, and so the doom loop continued, with interest rates going further and further south to zero or below. As conglomerates and governments became reliant on a diet of interest-free loans, with companies in developing countries borrowing more than their governments in excess of $2 trillion by the end of the 2010s, the central bankers faced an ugly dilemma. either switch off the money taps, which would mean blowing up financialized capitalism, having printed all that money to save it, or continue to pump money into the system, hoping for a miracle to intervene, but in reality, facilitating the replacement of profit as capitalism's motivating power and lubricant. Surprisingly, they chose the latter. The central bank's anguish was the cloudless delight. It was in this period that intrepid and talented entrepreneurs like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk were able to build up their super expensive, ultra powerful cloud capital without needing to do any of the three things that capitalists traditionally had to do to expand: borrow money from some banks, sell large portions of their business to others, or generate large profits to pay for new capital stock. Why suffer any of this when central bank money was flowing freely? And so between 2010 and 2021, the paper wealth of these two men, meaning the total price of their shares, rose from less than. Okay, so the reason there was silence is not because your headphones died, it's because this part of the book is confusing me right now. I tried to search up on the internet and try to understand what exactly Yanis meant, but what is written down, and I'm going to read literally what is written down, is that he says that rose from less than 10,000 million to around 200,000 billion apiece. I'm not sure what exactly that means, and those numbers are a bit confusing. I'm guessing that 10,000 billion, a million would be 10 billion, and then 200,000 billion is equivalent to 20 trillion. But then, for example, on YouTube, there is like a audiobook from Yanis, or with Yanis reading it, and he says a different value. So I don't know. Sorry for interrupting the reading. Let's get back to it. To be clear, the free central bank money did not go directly to the cloudalists. It simply flowed the path of least resistance. First, via the banks, it reached the managers of traditional conglomerates. Aghast at the poverty of the masses, they scorned real investment and used it to buy back their own shares. The sums involved were so vast that, like an undiscriminated tide, they lifted the price of every asset around them: shares, bonds, derivatives. Any and every piece of paper that financiers put up for sale went up in price. No one cared whether that piece of paper would eventually turn a profit. As long as the central bank was trapped into producing new money, they knew that the trashiest piece of paper would sell for more tomorrow than it fetched yesterday. The financial press call it an everything rally. It went on for more than a decade, with shares in companies skyrocketing independently of whether the companies themselves turned a profit or not. The wealthy got immensely wealthier in their sleep. Then came the pandemic, giving the everything rally another almighty boost. The morning of 12th of August of 2020 in London, which you and I witnessed on the balcony at Aegina, was a case in point. Fearing that lockdown would cause an irreversible stumble in the economy, central banks did a lot more of what they had been doing since 2008. They cranked up their digital printing presses to breaking point. In the ensuing cacophony, terrestrial capitalists, traditional car companies, oil corporations, steel producers, and the like were happy to sit on their growing paper wealth, transforming it into real estate or other traditional assets. By contrast, cloudalists like Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk attacked quickly to turn their paper wealth before it vanished into a far greater value extractor: cloud capital. Both knew that profit was irrelevant. What mattered was seizing the opportunity to establish total market dominance. In 2021, Goldman Sachs, one of Wall Street's least likable banks, stunned the financial world by publishing a non-profitable technology index, which perfectly demonstrates capitalism's emancipation from profits. Between 2017 and the beginning of the pandemic, loss-making cloudalists companies saw their share value rise by 200%. By the middle of the pandemic, their value had exploded to 500% their 2017 level. During 2020, Amazon's best year since its inception, when its pandemic-fueled sales went through the roof, Bezos' company booked sales worth $44 billion at its global headquarters in Ireland, but paid exactly zero corporate tax because it posted not a cent of profits. Similarly, with Tesla, even though its profits margins hovered just above zero, Tesla shares price soared from around $90 at the beginning of 2020 to over $700 at the year's end. Using their appreciating shares as collateral, the cloudalists mopped up many of the billions sloshing around within the financial system. With them, they paid for server farms, fiber optic cables, artificial intelligence laboratories, gargantuan warehouses, software developers, top-notch engineers, promising startups, and all the rest. In an environment where profit had become optional, the cloudalists seized up the central bank money to build a new empire. Meanwhile, the undermining of one capitalism's core principles, the profit motive, had knock-on effects on the others. Imagine Jillian, who works for a private care provider in England's home country. At some point in the mid-2010s, she hears that the company had been purchased by a private equity firm. She doesn't know what private equity means and hasn't heard of the firm that now owns her employer. But she and her co-workers are assured that they have nothing to fear. The new management is only interested in helping the company flourish. At first, Gillian notices little differences. They save the snazzier logo and some general sprucing up. However, behind the scenes, the new owners split the company into two separate companies. A care service provider, say CareCom, which employs Gillian and all the other staff who provide the care, and another company, say PropCom, that owns all of its property, its building, equipment, vans, and so on, which then charges CareCom rent for its use. Before long, PropCom increases the rents it is charging CareCom and announces further steep rent increases. CareCom's management gathered together Gillian and her co-workers and, signing the increased rents, explained that unless they accept longer working hours for no extra pay, CareCom will have to be wound up. Meanwhile, using the boosts in its long-term rent revenues from CareCom as collateral, PropCom takes out a large loan from a bank. Within days, the loan has become the evidence in the pockets of the shareholders of the private equity firm. Within 5 years, CareCom has been wound up. After 5 years of rapid worsening pay and conditions, Gillian and her fellow workers have been thrown out of work, while large contracts to provide care to local communities, paid for in advance for taxpayers, have been unceremoniously dishonored. But along with all other real estate during the everything rally, the value of PropCom has appreciated. Once PropCom's property has been sold, the bank that lent it the money is made whole, and the private equity firm keeps the rest of the behalf of its investors. This sordid exercise has a soothing, if mystifying name: dividend recapitalization. Though to call it that would be akin to relabeling a bank robbery as asset distribution. The private equity firm that cost Gillian her job has appreciated. Straightforward asset stripping with financialization providing the necessary smoke and mirrors. Looters who have created no new value have simply ransacked a pre-existing care provider. To use the language of early economists like Adam Smith, it is a classic case of feudal rent defeating capitalist profit. of wealth extraction by those who already have it triumphing over the creation of new wealth by entrepreneurs. And the key point to note is that the success of such a scheme depends on those looters being able to sell subsidiaries like Propcom at high enough prices once the original company has been destroyed. Before 2008, when capitalism still relied on profit as its motive power, it would not have been possible for such a scheme to be generalized. If it were, and too many of the various propcoms went on sale at the same time, their value would fall. This is what gave Adam Smith his optimism about capitalism, his faith that capitalist profit would continue to triumph over feudal rent. In reality, since Smith wrote his famous lines in the 1770s, rent has survived and even prospered under capitalism. Cartels, consumer gouging, the technostructure's successful manufacturing of desires for things we do not need, financialized asset stripping, all of these practices have been generated increasing rents within capitalism. Nevertheless, Smith's optimism was supported by the bigger picture. Rent survived only parasitically on and in the shadow of profit. That changed after 2008, with the central bank replacing profit as the fuel of the economy, and with the everything rally driving the price of propcom like subsidiaries ever upwards. Private equity could take over and successfully asset strip as many capitalist firms as it could lay its hand on all at once. And that was not all. Socialism for the financiers gave rise to another cluster of financial uberlords to rival the cloudless. Three U.S. companies with powers exceeding those of private equity and all terrestrial capitalists but together: BlackRock, Vanguard, and State Street. These three firms, the Big Three as they're known in financial circles, effectively own American capitalism. No, I am not exaggerating. Most people have not heard of them, but they have heard of the companies the Big Three own, which include America's major airlines: America, Delta, United Continental, much of Wall Street, GP Morgan, Chase, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citigroup, and car makers such as Ford, General Motors. Together, the Big Three are the largest single shareholder in the almost 90% of firms listed in the New York Stock Exchange, including Apple, Microsoft, ExxonMobil, General Electric, and Coca-Cola. As for the dollar value of the Big Three shares, it has too many zeros to mean much. At the time of writing, BlackRock manages nearly $10 trillion in investments, Vanguard $8 trillion, and State Street $4 trillion. To make sense of these numbers, they are almost exactly the same as the U.S. national income, or the sum of the national incomes of China and Japan, or the sum of total incomes of the Eurozone, the UK, Australia, Canada, and Switzerland. How did that happen? The official version is that the Big Three's founders spotted a gap in the financial markets: ultra-rich people and institutions wanting to be passive investors. That is, to buy shares without having to choose what they are buying, or even to choose professionals who will choose for them. To service their need for safe, mindless share purchases, the Big Three take the money of the seriously wealthy and buy literally everything, shares to be precise, in every business listed in New York Stock Exchange. Giving your money to the Big Three to buy shares on your behalf thus became equivalent to having bought a chunk not of individual companies but of the entire New York Stock Exchange. These could not have happened before 2008 because until then, the ultra-rich simply did not have access to enough cash with which the Big Three could buy a significant chunk of the New York Stock Exchange. After 2008, however, central bank-sponsored socialism for the ultra-rich created more than enough money. Thereafter, the rise of the Big Three to such supreme financial power was almost inescapable. And now that they are there, the Big Three enjoy two unsurmountable advantages: unprecedented monopoly power over the entire sectors, from airlines and banking to energy and Silicon Valley, and a capacity to offer the ultra-rich high returns for the very low fees. These two advantages allow the big three to extort rents at a scale that would have made Adam Smith weep. I could almost hear Smith's voice, which I imagine with a tinge of Scottish accent, lamenting that after 2008, in the name of saving capitalism, central banks snuffed out capitalism's dynamism and advantage. I can imagine his dismay that harmful, quasi-feudal rent got a chance to exact a historic revenge on fruitful capitalist profit, with profit-seeking co-signed to the aspirant petty bourgeois, while the truly rich gleefully whisper to one another that profit is for losers. I can picture his exasperation that the treasured guardians of capitalism, such as the Fed and the Bank of England, had funded a new form of cloud capital that is today snuffing out markets and turning consumers from sovereign agents into the playthings of algorithms that lie outside of the effective control of markets, governments, and perhaps even their inventors. Time for a confession. In 1993, when you posed your killer question after I had connected you to the fledgling internet, I was not up to the challenge. It had been a couple of years since the left's greatest defeat, the collapse of what was known as really existing socialism, from the demise of the USSR and its satellites to China's espousal of capitalist labor markets to India's alliance with neoliberalism. Developments that appended within a year more than 2 billion additional proletarians to the capitalist system. And looking back, I was perhaps too eager to clutch at any straw that might revive the prospect of a progressive alternative to capitalism, while not naive enough to ignore that capitalism had become unassailable. I had allowed myself to dream improbable dreams. Impressed by the early internet commons and mesmerized by a very early 3D printer I had chanced upon at an MIT laboratory, I fantasized about groups of young designers forming cooperatives using industrial-scale 3D printers to create a variety of goods, from professionalized cars to made-to-order refrigerators, at a cost that did not require mass production to stay low. Such cooperatives might, I hoped, steal an advantage over the General Motors and General Electrics of the capitalist world. That, to use the language of economists, the economies of scale that underpin the power of General Motors and General Electric would be eradicated, activating a process that would at least deplete corporate power and might perhaps pave the way towards a decent non-capitalist future. It was not just wishful thinking. It was a spectacular failure to foresee how a new form of capital, not a bunch of non-capitalist cooperatives, would grow out of the internet to turn the likes of General Motors and General Electric into shadows of their former selves. Taken in by the early internet and its market-free, decentralized nature, I fell headlong into a monumental diagnostic error. Assuming wrongly that capitalism's only serious threat was the rise of organized labor, I missed completely the epic transformation of our times. How the privatization of the internet commons, aided by the 2008 crisis that led central banks to open the floodgates of state money, would beget a new, super powerful type of capital. How this cloud capital would spawn a new ruling class. How revolutionary the new ruling class would prove, leveraging its cloud capital to make almost the whole of humanity work for them, either for free or for a pittance, including many capitalists. And, crucially, what a backward step all that would prove in the grand scheme of emancipating humanity and the planet from exploitation. Remarkably, as with all historic transformations, no one planned it. No capitalist imagined becoming a cloudalist. No central bankers aimed at funding the cloudalists. No politician saw the damage cloud capital would inflict upon democratic politics. In the same way that capitalism came about against the will of everyone, including the kings and bishops, as well as the peasants, the rise of the cloudalists happened out of sight and behind the back of the vast majority, including the most powerful of historical agents. Knowing what we know, two questions arise. The first concerns the sustainability of the cloudless dominance. As I write, war in Ukraine has turbocharged the mild inflation that came in the wake of the pandemic, thus causing central banks to cease minting new monies. If I am right, that it was central banks' cash that funded the cloudless, would cloudless power recede as the river of central bank money run dry? Could the good old capitalist conglomerates rely on terrestrial capital make a comeback? The second question, which I can imagine you putting to me forcefully, is more about language. Is it life under cloudless reign fundamentally different from under capitalism? Are the cloudless really so different from the capitalists that we need a newfangled term? Technofeudalism for the system we live in today? Why not just call it hypercapitalism or platform capitalism? These are the questions I address in the next chapter. But first, let us return for a moment to your beloved Hesiod. Besides warning us that every new age forged by some revolutionary technology yields a generation who never rests from labor and sorrows by day or from perishing by night, Hesiod also bequeathed us a crucial allegory, that of an aristocrat, of gods dwelling above the clouds that encircle Mount Olympus, jealously holding on their exuberant power over us mortals. In describing such a world as if it were the natural and eternal order of things, Hesiod challenged humanity with a hard question, one that is as pertinent to us as it was to the Iron Age generation. Can the cloud-dwelling aristocrats' power ever be claimed by the mortals? Would we mortals know what to do with it if we got hold of it? In other words, was Prometheus a fool to steal the fire of technology from the gods? If not, what would the task of a modern Prometheus be in the age of cloud capital? This is the ultimate question that I will seek to answer in the final chapter of this book. All right, that was very interesting. This was clearly a shorter chapter. This chapter only had 24 pages, if I'm correct, whilst the last ones had like 34. They had 10 more pages, so that does end up adding a bit to the episode time. So I'm glad this one is a little bit shorter. Not sure how long the next one is. It's 28. I just checked, so it's a little larger. But before getting into this chapter, I believe, what we talked about or what we read in the last episode, he ends up by saying that prophets kind of had lost their meaning. And I hadn't quite 100% understood what he meant by that. Now I get it. I get that he's now saying that prophets are no longer like the driving force towards gains in capitalism, or in his case, in techno-feudalism, because basically they just kind of are stuck in a loop, and their profit motives is to generate as much wealth as possible through cloud capital, and in basically investing into cloud capital with the central bank's money. So it's basically like a infinite money glitch at this point, where we are just making money essentially for the enrichment of the cloudalists, and that the rest of us are actually not getting any money from the central banks. I mean, that's not the whole point of the central banks making money, but that essentially they are just financing cloud capital and nothing else. That's a very interesting idea. It's a very interesting idea that that ever since 2008, that our whole financial system has changed, from capitalism to a new form, to a new metamorphosis, or a something that is so new that it's killed capitalism and has, instated a new system that is not at all like capitalism in the sense that it doesn't, doesn't is not driven by profit, is not driven by, kind of the original ideas of capitalism, and that is very interesting and kind of scary because we are dealing with a new monster, a new thing that we are going to have to deal with. So I know that in the next few chapters, the next one is What's in a Word, I think that's the title of it. And there's one which is, let me check. It's something to do with like how can we defeat techno-feudalism? Was it? Yeah, escape from techno-feudalism. Not sure if that's the next one or if it is, or the next one after the one I just said. No, there's Technofeudalism's global impact. So we still got some good chapters to go. We're a little less than halfway through the book, so we're almost up to halfway. Not quite, but yeah, we still have a good amount of chapters. So this was chapter 4. We have up to, what is it, like chapter 7 or 8? I don't even remember. It's been a while since I've read his explanation and seeing how many chapters it was. For you, it's only been a few weeks, but for me, it's been longer. But yeah, anyways. Of course, if you enjoyed this episode, you can support us over on Patreon. If you can support us on Patreon, you can always go to the description and check out our link to our website where you can check out how you can support us in alternative forms. In general, those alternative forms are honestly a much bigger support or a much bigger help than any money you throw at us will ever help us. So, go check that out. And of course, also make sure to join us on our public Discord server. If you do so, and you also happen to support us on Patreon, don't forget that you can submit questions for our podcast Q&A, where we, on our weekly podcast, at the end of the episode, we try to answer your questions as best as we can. And of course, also make sure to check out our social media platforms, where in the case of Politdigm Reads, we will, for example, keep you posted on the newest books that we plan to read. Currently, a few weeks or days, not sure when this episode is coming out, we announced that we have some new books that we acquired that we are going to read. One from Marx, one from Engels, one from Lenin, and one from Rosa Luxemburg. So we have, some books coming. So make sure to check out our social media if you're curious for what other series are coming next after this one. And with that being said, I have nothing to say anymore. I hope that you enjoy watching this episode. I hope that you have an amazing day. And I'll see you all next week. Goodbye, everybody.